In this presentation, we're going to be talking about the concept of feedback and how feedback shows up in our worlds, how we use feedback effectively and sometimes not effectively, and what we can do to both receive and give feedback in an effective manner. So let's go ahead and get started. So what exactly is feedback? For purposes of our class, feedback is information, comments, thoughts, suggestions, criticisms, etc., provided by others about an occurrence or behavior. I want to really emphasize about occurrence or behavior. So it can be about two different things: an event, a circumstance, something happening in the moment, or my behavior or somebody else's behavior, what I'm doing in that moment. It is delivered in the form of opinions about and reactions to something based on another person's perspective. It's intended to provide useful information for future decision making and personal development. And with that particular intention, I really want to highlight that feedback is another person's perspective. So it's based on how they're viewing the situation or your behavior, on their own upbringings or feelings about a situation or experiences that they've had in the past, but it is based on their own perspective, not necessarily on what you're experiencing or what you're seeing in that particular circumstance or even what you intended in your behavior. So feedback is about helping us get perspective on something so that we can make decisions and we can grow as an individual. Feedback is also something that we engage in on a regular basis whether we realize it or not. I'd like you to take just a few moments to think about, maybe jot down in your notebook, what types of things do you give and receive feedback on in your daily lives? So this is something we do all the time, whether we realize it or not. So what are those things that you're doing when you're giving and or receiving feedback in your lives? Just take a few seconds to think about that, maybe 30 seconds or so. Pause the presentation and think about that and jot it down in your notebook. One area that we give and receive feedback quite often in our daily lives that we may not even really realize it is Facebook. Facebook is almost entirely feedback. Whether you like someone's status update or you comment on their profile picture, or you're commenting on a link that they put up, or you're liking a picture that they posted, all of those are forms of giving feedback. And as we talked about in the cueless communication portion of this class, when somebody likes something on Facebook, that doesn't always mean the same thing to everybody. For example, if I post something about having an awful day and somebody likes it, does that mean that they're happy that I had an awful day? Or does that mean that they understand and are empathetic to me, or that they've been in that situation before? What exactly does that mean? It is a form of feedback, and sometimes I'm not always clear on what the feedback is that I'm giving or receiving on places like feedback or Facebook that are cueless communication. I want you to think about your own experience. If you have Facebook or some other social media that you use a lot, how many of you can think of a time when you either read something or saw something or something was posted on your wall that made you either feel incredibly happy or it made you really, really mad? You got it in your head? The majority of those things that you saw were probably some form of feedback. As a challenge, when you're done here, watch this video, sign on to your Facebook account or some other social media and actually take a look at and stop and pay attention to how much of or what is on your Facebook that is actually feedback. And get an idea of what it is that we do on a day-to-day basis in this realm of Facebook with feedback. So we know that feedback is something that we engage in often in our day-to-day lives, whether it be on Facebook or some kind of feedback from our teachers or feedback from our bosses at work or feedback from our parents, this is something that we often engage in. And so the next step about thinking about this, because we know we're in it a lot, is to really explore our relationship with feedback. How do we feel about feedback? Is it comfortable for us? Is it uncomfortable for us? All of those kinds of things. So I want you to pause the presentation in just a moment and take a few minutes to address both of these in your class notebook. So describe what you value most about giving and receiving feedback. What do you think is important about it? Why do we engage in it? What do you value about it? And then describe what is difficult about giving and receiving feedback. Where do you struggle? What are times that it's hard for you? But really thinking about when it's difficult. So just take a couple of minutes and pause the presentation right now and just write down your thoughts in your class notebook. And perhaps we'll be talking about these in face-to-face. Now that we've explored a little bit about our relationship with feedback, let's talk about how do we do this effectively. Think about feedback. There's two sides of this. There's the giving of the feedback and the receiving of the feedback. And at any given time, we are on either side of that relationship, and perhaps maybe sometimes on both sides. So let's talk about receiving feedback. Some tips or some things to think about when you're getting that information from somebody else. The purpose of providing feedback, or for our purposes, is to support people with gaining empathy for somebody else's perspective of the situation. So they're offering you their perspective of the situation. So when you're getting that feedback or receiving that feedback, you really want to try to have empathy for their perspective and look at what in that information might be valuable to you. What might you learn from it? What might you be able to take away from it? How might it inform your future decisions or your future behavior? By being able to see that from somebody else's perspective, what is it that I can actually gain from that? Feedback can be negative or positive. Sometimes it can be really easy to hear feedback when it comes, in praise or things that you're doing well. And sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult to hear it when it's the criticisms or the areas that I need to improve on. And in either case, both negative and positive, we get to choose how we take in that feedback. What we gain from it, how we respond to it, all of that stuff. We get to choose how that goes. Really, if you think about this, we have a responsibility. And when you break down that word responsibility, it breaks down to response and ability, which is basically our ability to respond in a particular way. So we get to choose how that's going to be. We can get upset and frustrated and hurt and pissed off about the feedback, or we can look at it and say, you know what? That's from somebody else's perspective. Maybe there's something there I can gain from it. Maybe there's something there that I could actually learn from it. And how I choose to take feedback or to use feedback in my own life can actually build or undermine my self-esteem and how I view myself and what I think about myself. So it really is about managing my response to that feedback. Will I allow the feedback to trigger the bad behaviors in me, or can I use it to support the good behaviors? And how does that relationship with receiving feedback affect how I respond to it? The main thing here is to remember that you are in control. You get to decide how you respond to that feedback and what you do with that feedback. Since you have the ability to respond to the feedback and actually get to decide what you do with it, the question really here to ask yourself is, does this opinion or perspective ring true for me? And as you ask yourself that question, does it ring true for me? Some other questions might arise or might help you answer that particular question. It may be that, for example, you're given feedback that you've heard many, many times before. You are fully aware of it about yourself, you have experienced it, you know that's the case, and in that case, it does ring true for you. It's familiar. And it's a sense of knowing that what is being said is true. So if you're already aware of it, maybe you've received that feedback before, then the answer to the question, does this opinion ring true for me? might very well be yes. It might also be that, for example, you've never heard the feedback. This is the first time that you've heard it. This is the first time that anybody has offered you this perspective. But the moment you hear it, the moment it reaches your ears, it occurs to you that this feedback is absolutely true. Perhaps it would even explain a lot about the results you've been getting in your life. And in that instance, it rings true for you because it makes sense and it resonates with you, even if you've never heard it before. There may also be the complete opposite of those two things, which is that you're completely shocked that anybody would ever say this thing about you. How could that be true? Why would you even put that into the world? You might feel defensive, or you want to deny that it's happening. And if these types of emotional reactions are happening in that situation, then the challenge becomes to be curious about it. Be curious about why someone might have this perspective of you. You might even go ask other people for additional feedback to see if perhaps you get that feedback from more than one place. It's really important to be honest with yourself when you're receiving this information, which is not always easy to do. Sometimes our initial gut reaction is, if I don't like it, I just disregard it, and it must not be true because I don't like what I'm hearing. But the challenge here is to not just disregard it just because you don't like it. Sometimes the feedback that we don't like is actually the feedback we need to hear in order to make adjustments that are going to serve us and help us get the results that we're looking for in life. Another question to ask ourselves when we're thinking about the feedback we're getting is it true? Is there anything at all about this feedback that resonates with me? Is there anything that perhaps I can take from this feedback that will help me develop as a person or a leader or a coworker or a roommate or whatever the case may be? You get to choose your reaction to the feedback as well as the type of action you take to address it. So whether you're going to change your behavior or do something differently or keep doing what you've done before, you get to choose what that may be. And remember that feedback is simply derived from somebody else's perspective of the situation. And in any given situation, there can be multiple perspectives or multiple viewpoints, all of which can be quote-unquote true. The things here to think about are, what if it is true and I disregard it? What happens then? What are the risks in this? If it's true and I disregard it and I don't actually change my behavior or I don't actually make a different decision, what might happen in that case? The flip side of that is, what if I take it as truth and it's not? What if I hear it enough times, or one person who's really important to me tells me it and I just simply accept it when really it's not the truth? What happens in that case? And what are the risks there? These are all things that we need to think about and we need to be aware of when we're receiving feedback so that we can make the best possible choices about what to do with that feedback, how I'm going to act, how I'm going to respond when I get that feedback, and so that I can get the most out of the feedback I'm receiving. Feedback can be very, very beneficial to us, and it's beneficial when we do something with it. So it's important to think about these things as I'm receiving that feedback. Now that we've talked about receiving feedback, the other side of that, or the flip side of that, is giving feedback. Really, the goal with giving feedback is to be constructive. You want to be aware of how you phrase and deliver the feedback, because both of those things will greatly influence how that message is received and if it's valued by the person that is getting that feedback. We've talked a lot about what you do when we receive feedback, but there's also a bit of responsibility in how we deliver that feedback so that the person receiving it can actually hear what we have to say. So the goal is to be constructive when we give feedback. So how do we do that? How do we provide constructive feedback? Well, here are 7 guidelines to help you do just that. The first one is to establish a climate of trust and respect. Remember that when we give feedback, it often hits a soft spot for people, or what we might refer to as our ego, and egos are fragile. So when we're giving feedback, we need to be sure to give feedback that is intended to support the person, not hurt the person. We need to be encouraging. And being overly negative often creates defensiveness. This isn't to say that we can't deliver feedback that is hard to hear, because sometimes feedback is hard to hear, and there are sometimes criticisms that need to be said. It's just a matter of how we deliver that feedback. It's important to address a person's strengths as well as what the things that need to be improved. The second tip is to not overwhelm the receiver. Limit the feedback to the amount of information that somebody can actually observe and do something about. It's important to identify the key areas, both positive and somewhat negative, instead of just bombarding the person with so much information and so many comments that they can't even possibly wade through that information to know what it is that they're supposed to get from it. So deliver it in small, digestible chunks. The third piece is to keep comments impersonal. So avoid personalizing by focusing on the problem, not the person. Instead of saying you statements like you never show up to class or you never come when we have group meetings, say something like we really miss when you're not in class, or it would be nice if you could show up to our group meetings. We'd love to hear about your perspective. It lets the person know that you are noticing that they're not present and that you would like them to be, without making it feel quite as much of an attack. Which kind of goes with number 4. Use I statements instead of you statements. Saying things like, I react more positively when I know that people have been listening to me, rather than saying you don't listen, will actually be much easier for somebody to digest. The fifth one, structure your comments as questions or suggestions rather than criticisms. So once again, this is about not attacking the person. You could, for example, ask if the person has any differences of opinion or difference of experience and what their perspective on something is, or how they might be able to contribute more to the conversation rather than saying you don't contribute to the conversation. Number 6, I think, is really important. Well, they're all really important. Avoid overstatements that use words like always, never, worst, or best. Instead of saying you are always interrupting people, you might try something saying like, when you interrupt me, I feel like you don't think that what I have to say is important. Chances are people are not always, never, or worst or best. That it's a pattern perhaps that we see, but it's not going to be always or never. And the last one, point to a solution as well as the problem. Instead of just saying you don't show up or you don't contribute to the group, rather than that, try to give them a solution. I really value your input, so perhaps you could tell me what you think after the group meeting. Or perhaps you could email me your opinion so I could hear what you have to say. This is really about giving them some way to improve on the behavior or the situation that perhaps you're not particularly fond of in that moment. This helps the person know what to do with the feedback, or gives them an idea of how they can actually change in order to be more effective.